Did you know that Philippe Égalité, the Duke of Orleans, voted to execute his own cousin, King Louis XVI? What if I told you that his execution was far more brutal than anything you've heard? It's a story drenched in betrayal, blood, and vengeance, one that shook the very foundations of France. His life and death weren't just political, they were a spectacle of raw, revolutionary power. What happened to Philippe after that fateful vote was far darker than most history books let on. A gruesome execution, a vengeful crowd, and a twist so chilling, it'll make you rethink everything you know about justice in the revolution. Born into the wealthiest family in France, second only to the king himself, Philippe lived in luxury, pulling the strings behind the scenes. But when the revolution came, Philippe thought he could play both sides, until the revolution turned on him. He wasn't just a noble, he was a man who thought power and wealth could buy him protection. He was wrong. From lavish parties to secret political dealings, Philippe held the reins of power in Paris. But the moment he voted for the execution of Louis XVI, he sealed his fate. A prince who became a traitor to his own kind, this is a story about ambition, politics, and ultimate betrayal. If you're into real, documented history that dives deep into the truth, don't forget to subscribe to Flashback Historian. Don't just be a passive observer of history, engage with it, and make sure you never miss a shocking fact like this one. If you're not subscribing yet, I wonder why. What's stopping you from learning more shocking historical facts like these? Trust me, you'll want to be here for the next one. Born into a world that few could imagine, Philippe Égalité, originally Philippe of Orleans, entered life as a living symbol of France's aristocracy. He was born on April 17, 1747, in the grand halls of the Château de Saint-Cloud, the son of the Duke of Orleans. His family's wealth was staggering, so immense that it rivaled the king's own riches. The Orleans family controlled vast estates that stretched across France, their fortune measured in millions of livres, and their power stretched from royal courtrooms to Parisian banks. Imagine a man, born to inherit not just wealth but the very essence of French nobility, second only to the king himself. Philippe was surrounded by privilege from the moment he took his first breath. But Philippe was no mere observer of this lavish world. He was groomed to be a key player in this sprawling system, his every move calculated to preserve and expand his family's dominance. He was raised with an understanding of his importance, his every whim catered to, his future sealed within the golden walls of his family's empire. He grew up in luxury, schooled in politics, philosophy, and the high arts of power, preparing to be a ruler of men, a kingmaker in his own right. Yet beneath the surface of opulence, there was an unsettling truth. Philippe never quite fit the mold of the typical aristocrat. Despite the comforts of his royal life, something began to stir within him, an unease about the system that kept him at the top. Unlike many of his fellow nobles, Philippe wasn't content to simply inherit his family's wealth and status. He was intellectually curious, a man with ideas that began to stretch beyond the palatial walls of his inheritance. As he came of age, Philippe's mind turned toward the Enlightenment. He began to immerse himself in the works of philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, men who preached the destruction of old institutions, the divine right of kings, and the unchallenged power of aristocracy. These ideas took root in his mind, planting the seeds for what would become one of the most politically dangerous transformations in French history. He was no longer just a nobleman of wealth, he was becoming a man of ideas, a revolutionary in the making. This internal conflict would only deepen over time. As France teetered on the brink of collapse, Philippe began to see the cracks in the foundation of his world. The people, suffering from starvation, poverty, and the crushing weight of taxes, were no longer willing to be subjugated by a system that demanded their blood, sweat, and tears. And Philippe saw that, he understood it. It was in this time of unrest that Philippe made a fateful decision that would alter the course of his life forever. As France's financial crisis deepened, and King Louis XVI called for the Estates General in 1789 to address the country's mounting debt, Philippe saw an opportunity, a chance to reshape not just his own destiny, but the very fabric of France. Rather than siding with the nobles, Philippe did the unthinkable. In a bold, almost reckless move, he sided with the Third Estate, the common people, the very class that had long been oppressed by the aristocracy. He cast aside his noble title and stood among the revolutionaries. A man born to rule, now positioning himself as a leader of the oppressed. Philippe had made his choice. His heart now beat for the revolution, for the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that were beginning to rise like a tidal wave against the monarchy. But this was no simple transition. This was a radical shift, a leap from privilege to peril. The Duke of Orleans, once a symbol of everything that the revolution sought to dismantle, was now standing in opposition to his own class. And this move didn't just surprise France, it horrified many of his contemporaries. To the king and his loyalists, Philippe was a traitor. To the revolutionaries, he was a convenient ally, but one who had much to prove. Philippe's decision to cast his lot with the revolution would cost him dearly. His actions were driven by ambition and a desperate desire to escape the shadows of his royal blood. But was it truly a belief in the revolution, or was it just another step in his long game to increase his own power? After all, he was no stranger to playing both sides. His connections, his wealth, and his machinations had always ensured his survival. But this time, he had taken a gamble that would ultimately consume him. Philippe didn't just support the revolution, he threw himself into it, funding printing presses, organizing rallies, and aligning himself with the radical leaders who were pushing the agenda of the revolution forward. He believed that by doing so, he could reshape France and secure a future where he, not the king, could wield power. But what he failed to realize was that revolutions do not make room for the rich and powerful. Revolutions devour them. As the revolution gained momentum, Philippe's position became more precarious. The more he sought to secure his power among the radicals, the more the monarchy pushed back. His cousin, Queen Marie Antoinette, viewed him with suspicion and distrust, calling him the gravedigger of the monarchy. It was an ironic statement, considering Philippe's involvement in the vote for King Louis XVI's death, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. By the time Philippe fully embraced the radical wing of the revolution, it was already too late. His ambition had blinded him to the true nature of the forces he had unleashed. The revolution was no longer a tool to control, it was an unstoppable fire that would consume everyone, from the nobility to the revolutionaries themselves. Are you following along with this amazing journey into French history? Hit that subscribe button if you don't want to miss the untold parts of this story, where betrayal, ambition, and revolution collide in ways you never imagined. Still not subscribed? Imagine missing out on more shocking history lessons like these. Comment below and let me know why you refuse to hit that button. France, once the epitome of grandeur and royal power, was crumbling from within. Beneath the gilded halls of Versailles, the lavish court life masked the rotting foundation of the kingdom. By the late 18th century, France was deep in debt, its coffers drained by endless wars, most notably the American Revolution. The crown, now burdened with an overwhelming national debt of 650 million livres, could no longer sustain the lavish lifestyles of the aristocracy or the king. The people, the very backbone of France, were starving. The peasants, already living on the brink of despair, were suffering even more under the strain of oppressive taxes. Bread, the basic staple of life, had doubled in price, making it out of reach for the common folk. Meanwhile, the nobility, the very class Philippe had been born into, feasted without a care in the world. The divide between the aristocracy and the working class had never been so stark. The once reverent view of the monarchy was being replaced with anger and resentment. Philippe, born to such privilege, watched from the sidelines as the storm began to gather. He saw the desperation of the people, and he knew something had to change. But he wasn't driven by compassion or justice. He saw an opportunity to rewrite the rules of power and secure a place for himself in this new world. His mind, ever calculating, began to see the revolution as not just an upheaval of the monarchy but a way to elevate his own status. He would be a revolutionary leader, yes, but one who stayed behind the scenes, pulling the strings. He had always been a puppet master, now, he wanted to be the puppeteer of France. But this revolution wasn't just about power, it was about survival. As the revolution gained momentum, Philippe's stance grew even more precarious. The gulf between the monarchy and the people was widening, and Philippe had chosen the side of the revolution. His decision to join the Third Estate in 1789 wasn't just an ideological stance, it was a calculated move to distance himself from the growing resentment against the aristocracy. By standing with the commoners, Philippe hoped to cast aside his royal blood and blend into the new order. But this was no simple political move. It was a dangerous gamble, one that would only feed into the distrust of the people who would never fully accept a nobleman, no matter how revolutionary his ideals might seem. The Estates General of 1789 was the spark that set the fire of revolution ablaze. Philippe's decision to join the Third Estate was an act of defiance, not just against the monarchy, but against his own bloodline. This wasn't merely a political act, it was a declaration of war against the old order. Philippe, once destined to rule as a kingmaker, had decided to bet everything on the revolution. The king, the queen, and the rest of the aristocracy were blindsided by Philippe's sudden shift in allegiance. His cousins, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, couldn't understand it. They saw Philippe as a man who had thrown away his birthright for the sake of power. But Philippe was no longer playing a game of titles and crowns. He was playing a much more dangerous game, the game of survival. He had thought the revolution could be controlled, that it could be molded into something that would serve his ambition. But as the Estates General grew into the National Assembly, and as the revolutionaries grew more radical, Philippe realized he had placed his fate in the hands of a force far beyond his control. The power he thought he could harness was now an uncontrollable beast, one that threatened to consume him. Philippe, however, was not one to sit idly by. As the revolution gathered steam, Philippe threw his full support behind it. He poured money into the cause, funding pamphlets, speeches, and even the printing presses that would rally the people. But his true goal was always hidden. He wanted to be the man behind the throne, the shadow figure pulling the strings of power. As the National Assembly took shape, Philippe continued to work from the background, seeking influence among the radical leaders. He believed, as he had for most of his life, that money and connections could bend the world to his will. But the revolution had no room for men like Philippe. It was not a revolution for the elite, it was a revolution against the elite. In the summer of 1792, the winds of change began to blow harder. The monarchy was on its last legs. Philippe's gamble had reached its climax. When King Louis XVI was put on trial for treason, Philippe knew the time had come. But instead of distancing himself, he made a fatal decision. On January 15, 1793, Philippe cast his vote for Louis XVI's death. His voice echoed through the chamber, sealing the fate of his cousin and his own future. The man who had once been part of the royal family now stood as the architect of his cousin's demise. But this was no ordinary vote. Philippe's vote was the point of no return. It was the final, irrevocable act of betrayal. He had crossed the line, and the revolution, now in full force, would never forgive him. In the following months, as Philippe tried to position himself as a behind-the-scenes leader of the revolution, he found himself tangled in a web of distrust. The revolution, with all its radical fervor, turned on him just as it had on the monarchy. Philippe, once a man of immense power, was now a man on the run, trying desperately to avoid the same fate he had helped condemn his cousin to. His past, his wealth, and his title were no longer shields, they were chains. Chains that would ultimately drag him to the guillotine. You can't understand modern revolutions without knowing the intricacies of Philippe's choices. This wasn't just a vote, it was a turning point in history. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale for more deep dives like this one. Still no subscription? You're missing out on the revolution of history itself. Share your thoughts in the comments on why you haven't subscribed yet, don't leave us hanging. It was January 15, 1793, an icy morning that would mark a turning point in French history, and in Philippe Égalité's life. The fate of King Louis XVI hung in the balance, and the weight of this decision would forever shape the revolutionary era. The convention was packed with fervent revolutionaries, each of them casting their votes for the future of France, either for the king's execution or for his exile. Philippe Égalité, once a member of the royal family, stood as one of the most controversial figures in the room. As a man born to the wealth and power of the Orleans family, his vote could have tipped the scales toward a more moderate resolution. But Philippe did not hesitate. When his name was called, he stood and spoke just 4 words that would echo through history: "I vote for death." It was not just his vote for the king's death that mattered, it was the weight behind it. Philippe's decision was an act of monumental betrayal. The king, his cousin, had trusted him. The monarchy, for which Philippe had once been a dutiful servant, now lay at his mercy. And Philippe, in that moment, chose the revolution over his bloodline. In doing so, Philippe severed the final ties that bound him to his noble heritage. He was no longer the Duke of Orleans. He was no longer Philippe, royal cousin. In the eyes of the revolutionaries, he had become Citizen Égalité, the man who would stand alongside the radicals, cast out his aristocratic past, and embrace the ideology of the revolution. It was a vote that would haunt him, but at the time, it seemed like the only choice. His mind had long been consumed by the idea of breaking free from the constraints of nobility and seizing the chance to wield power. But the consequences of this vote were more far-reaching than Philippe could ever have imagined. He had believed that his move would elevate him, that by siding with the revolution, he could become its hidden force, guiding France toward a more just and equal future. But what he failed to understand was that the revolution, once set in motion, would not be so easily controlled. The revolution would demand not just blood, but the very lives of those who had once stood above it all. Philippe's decision was not just political, it was personal. He saw this as his moment to be remembered not just as a member of the royal family, but as a man who had played a pivotal role in the creation of the new France. But in casting his vote, Philippe sealed his own fate. His connection to the monarchy was now irreparable, and no amount of revolutionary fervor could erase the shadow of that vote. The revolutionaries had been calling for the king's head for months, and the debate over his fate had become a battleground for competing ideologies. On one side were the Girondins, moderate revolutionaries who believed the king should be exiled, to live out his days in a foreign land. They argued that a king in exile was preferable to a martyr, that his death would only galvanize the remaining royalists and give the monarchy a new, dangerous myth to rally behind. But Philippe, along with the radical Montagnards, had no such hesitation. The king was not just a symbol of the old regime, he was the embodiment of everything that had oppressed France for centuries. For Philippe, voting for death was a necessary step in ensuring that the revolution's fire would burn bright and unchallenged. He believed that by eliminating the monarchy, they would eradicate the last vestiges of tyranny in France. No longer would the aristocracy and the monarchy hold sway over the people. This was to be a new world, a world of equality, a world where the revolutionaries would hold the power. Philippe's decision was not one made lightly. His vote came with a deep, ideological commitment to the revolution's ideals: freedom, equality, fraternity. He believed that by supporting the death of the king, he was helping to pave the way for a better France. But the irony was crushing: the very revolution he believed in would ultimately consume him. As he sat among the radical leaders, Philippe convinced himself that he was doing what was necessary for the cause. But he was blind to the fact that this revolution, like all revolutions, was a beast that could not be tamed. Philippe had gambled everything on the belief that he could control it, that his wealth and influence could keep him safe. But the revolution, once unleashed, had no mercy. There were no heroes in the revolution, only those who survived and those who did not. Philippe's fate was sealed the moment he cast his vote for the king's death. He had hoped to use the revolution for his own ends, but in the end, it would use him. This is where history pivots. This vote was not just a political move, it was the moment that irrevocably altered the future of France and Philippe's own destiny. Subscribe now to see the consequences of this one vote and how it led to an irreversible fate for Philippe Égalité. Not interested in subscribing? Just think about how much you're missing. History like this doesn't come around often. Leave a comment telling us why you wouldn't want more fascinating history at your fingertips. The summer of 1792 was a season of dread, of uncertainty, and of escalating violence. The revolution, once a noble cause to overthrow tyranny, had now become a relentless force of vengeance. Philippe Égalité, the man who had once stood proudly in the gilded halls of his family's estates, now found himself caught in the whirlwind of terror that was sweeping through France. The September massacres were the apex of this madness. It began as whispers in the streets of Paris, rumors of royalist conspirators, plots to overthrow the revolutionary government, and suspicions of foreign spies embedded within the prisons of Paris. But in the heat of the revolution, whispers became actions, and actions became bloodshed. For days, mobs of revolutionaries stormed the prisons, dragging suspected enemies of the state from their cells and slaughtering them in cold blood. Over 1,400 men and women were massacred, their lives snuffed out in a frenzy of ideological rage. It was a purge, a reckoning, and a terrifying display of the revolution's shift from idealism to brutality. Philippe watched as the tides turned against the moderates, against those who believed the revolution could remain just. The revolution was now in full swing, and the specter of terror loomed large over all who had once thought they were untouchable. Philippe's transformation was not just political, it was psychological. Once a man of wealth and privilege, now, he was citizen égalité. He had shed his aristocratic name, his family ties, and his nobility. He had embraced the revolution, but in doing so, he had lost his identity. His transition to citizen égalité wasn't just a change of name, it was a symbolic shedding of everything he had once stood for. The aristocratic Duke of Orleans was dead. In his place stood a man willing to give everything, his title, his wealth, his blood, to the revolution. But it wasn't a transformation born out of noble conviction, it was one born out of survival. Philippe believed that in this new world, to survive was to adapt. And so, he changed. He thought that by aligning himself with the radicals, he could ensure his safety, his power, and his legacy. But this was a false hope. The terror was not something that could be controlled or manipulated. Philippe was no longer a man of reason, he was a man at the mercy of the revolution's fevered impulses. And the revolution was hungry. Philippe's deeper commitment to the revolution didn't come without its price. To secure his place within the radical faction, he cultivated dangerous alliances with the most extreme figures of the revolution. One of these men was Maximilien Robespierre, the man who would later become the face of the Reign of Terror. Robespierre was a man of unyielding conviction, a man whose radicalism knew no limits. Philippe, ever the strategist, saw in Robespierre an ally who could help propel him into the new order. He believed that by aligning himself with Robespierre and the Montagnards, he could not only survive but thrive in the changing political landscape of revolutionary France. But Robespierre's world was one of ruthless justice, where loyalty was fleeting, and alliances were as fragile as the guillotine's blade. To Philippe's former aristocratic peers, his relationships with these revolutionaries were nothing short of treasonous. They saw him as a man who had abandoned his birthright, a man who had sided with the very people who had once been beneath him. But Philippe, blinded by ambition and the desire to protect himself, pressed on. He thought that his ties with the revolutionaries would grant him a safe passage through the storm. But instead, they pulled him deeper into the quagmire of suspicion and violence. As Philippe's relationships with men like Robespierre deepened, so too did the perception that he was a traitor. His aristocratic blood, once seen as a symbol of power, now made him a target. The revolution was not forgiving, especially not to those who had once represented the old order. Philippe was caught between his past and the revolution's brutal future. His former allies, the Girondins, had already been crushed by the radical forces. Philippe's defection to the revolution had severed any hope of redemption from his old life. But worse still, the revolutionaries themselves were turning on each other. Robespierre and his followers were growing more paranoid, more distrustful. The Reign of Terror had begun, and Philippe's involvement, once seen as a strategic alliance, was now a dangerous game. Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, had become Philippe Égalité, but in the eyes of the revolutionaries, he was still a royal bloodline, a potential threat to the revolution's survival. His alliances, once his shield, were now his chains. The more deeply he embedded himself in the revolution, the more he alienated those who once saw him as a prince, a leader of men. To the people who now controlled France, Philippe was no longer a man with a future, he was a relic, a symbol of the past that had no place in the new world they were creating. Philippe's transformation into Citizen Égalité is just the beginning of his tragic end. Watch how the choices he made, his alliances, his sacrifices, lead him down a dark path from which there is no return. Subscribe to Flashback Historian to follow this explosive journey through history. I can't understand why someone wouldn't subscribe. Don't you want to know what happens next? The twists and turns of this dark journey into revolution are just beginning. Drop a comment telling me why you're still not convinced. It was a cold morning in the spring of 1793 when Philippe Égalité, once the powerful Duke of Orleans, found himself shackled, betrayed by the very revolution he had championed. For a man who had spent his life navigating the labyrinth of French power, manipulating people, and bending situations to his advantage, this was the final betrayal, a moment that no amount of wealth or influence could undo. Philippe had seen the storm clouds gathering, the revolution turning into a beast that could no longer be controlled. He had stood on the side of the revolution, believing that his ties to the cause, his financial support, and his political maneuvering would protect him. But as the Reign of Terror deepened, the revolution had become a monster with an insatiable hunger. And Philippe, once the architect of the revolution's success, was now one of its most prominent victims. It began with whispers, rumors that Philippe, despite his revolutionary loyalty, was seen as a threat. His aristocratic blood was a mark of suspicion, no matter how much he had aligned himself with the radical cause. The Montagnards, the very faction he had worked so closely with, began to view him not as an ally, but as a liability. His past, his connections, his wealth, all of it made him a dangerous figure in the eyes of those who had risen to power through the revolution's most violent phases. On the morning of his arrest, Philippe was sitting at breakfast, as he did every day, in his luxurious residence, when the door burst open. Revolutionary guards, armed and grim-faced, entered his chambers, presenting him with an arrest warrant. The charges were clear: conspiracy against the liberty of the nation and intelligence with the enemies of the Republic. The word stung. Philippe had once been a revolutionary hero, but now he was just another traitor to be dealt with. Philippe's reaction was a mixture of shock and disbelief. He was still the Duke of Orleans, still a man of power. How could they arrest him, someone who had sacrificed so much for the cause? But this was the cruel reality of revolution. It consumed those who had once been at the top, and Philippe, despite his best efforts, had become a relic of the past. His arrest wasn't just a personal loss, it was the ultimate realization that the revolution was no longer about ideals, but about survival. As the guards led him away from his home, Philippe's mind raced. What had gone wrong? His mind, always calculating, turned over the events that had brought him to this point. He had fought so hard to change his fate, to align himself with the revolutionaries, and now it seemed all for nothing. His fate was sealed, and there was no escaping it. Philippe was taken to the infamous Conciergerie, the prison that had become the final resting place for many revolutionaries, including Queen Marie Antoinette. It was a cold, oppressive place, its stone walls closing in around him. Once a man of wealth and status, now Philippe was reduced to a common prisoner, his family's wealth meaningless in the face of revolutionary justice. The revolution that he had once believed in, the one that promised equality and justice, now revealed its darkest side. It was no longer about ideals, it was about power, and who held it. The revolution had turned on its own, and Philippe had become its victim. The sense of paranoia in revolutionary France had reached a fever pitch. Everyone was under suspicion. Even the leaders of the revolution, once allies, now watched each other warily, knowing that anyone could be next. The revolutionary government, led by men like Robespierre, had become a brutal machine, hungry for blood. Philippe, like many before him, had become a casualty of this paranoia. His every move, every decision, was now scrutinized. The revolution that he had once believed in now saw him as a symbol of the old world, a world of privilege, wealth, and power. His political machinations, his alliances, and his revolutionary contributions now seemed irrelevant. All that mattered now was survival, and Philippe had no guarantees. As he sat in his tiny cell, awaiting trial, he had time to reflect on the irony of his situation. The revolution had promised equality, yet those who had fought hardest for it were often the first to fall. Philippe had played the game well, but in the end, the game had played him. His son, Louis Philippe, who had defected to the Austrians during the war, now seemed like the only surviving member of the Orléans family who might escape the revolution's wrath. But Philippe's future, and the future of his family, seemed bleak. The revolution had devoured its own children. Philippe's dreams of a new world, of power behind the scenes, had died along with the monarchy. His legacy was now one of betrayal, not just against his family, but against the very cause he had championed. You followed Philippe's rise, now see his brutal fall. From a man of wealth and privilege to a prisoner of revolution, his story is a reminder of how quickly the tides of power can turn. Subscribe for a closer look at what happened after he was arrested. If you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing out on a major twist in the story. Why haven't you hit that button yet? Let us know in the comments, and we'll dive deeper into Philippe's tragic end. The courtrooms of revolutionary France were not places of justice, they were theaters of spectacle. Philippe Égalité, once a duke, a man of immense power and wealth, now stood as a mere pawn in the revolution's deadly game. The trial was nothing short of a public display of the revolution's brutal power. His presence in the tribunal was an act of public execution in itself. It wasn't just a trial, it was a symbol. A symbol that no one, no matter their past or their wealth, was immune from the blade of revolutionary justice. Philippe's trial began on October 3, 1793. He was charged with treason, conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, and intelligence with the enemies of the Republic. His past, a labyrinth of noble privilege and political intrigue, had come back to haunt him. The charges were built on the foundation of his own actions, the financial dealings, the meetings with foreign agents, the letters from his son, Louis Philippe, now exiled in Austria. The very things he had once believed would protect him, his wealth, his connections, were now the chains that bound him. Philippe stood before the tribunal, a man stripped of his title, stripped of his dignity. He tried to defend himself, to argue that his actions had been for the good of France, that he had been a champion of liberty. But the court was not interested in his pleas. They were not there to listen to reason, they were there to deliver judgment. And Philippe, for all his wealth and influence, was powerless. The emotional toll of the trial was evident on Philippe's face. Here was a man who had once stood at the heights of power, his every word a command. Now, he stood humiliated, his past deeds held against him by the very people who had once called him an ally. As he tried to plead for mercy, his voice shook. The revolution, he had once believed in, had no place for him. His vote for the death of Louis XVI, the very act that had defined his role in the revolution, now turned against him. It was as though history had come full circle. He had voted for the king's death, and now, the revolution demanded his blood in return. Despite his defenses, the judgment was clear. The tribunal, led by men like Robespierre and Saint-Just, had no room for mercy. Philippe was guilty, and the sentence was inevitable, death within 24 hours. There was no escape, no reprieve. The revolution, once his ally, had now condemned him to the same fate he had helped seal for his cousin, King Louis XVI. It was a cruel irony, a testament to how quickly the revolution devours its own. November 6, 1793, broke cold and unforgiving. The air in Paris had grown sharp with winter's bite, but it was not the weather that would freeze the blood of those who witnessed the spectacle about to unfold. The day began early, as Philippe was taken from his cell at the Conciergerie, the grim stone prison that had already claimed the lives of so many before him. His final journey to the scaffold would be slow, deliberate, a reminder of how far the revolution had come from its original ideals. Philippe's hands were bound, his face pale and weary. He had no dignity left, no grandeur of aristocracy to cling to. He was simply another prisoner, another victim of the revolution's insatiable hunger. As the cart, the infamous tumbril of death, creaked through the narrow streets of Paris, Philippe's mind raced. His past, his mistakes, his ambition, all of it had led him to this moment. The execution was not just an end, it was the final chapter in the tragic saga of a man who had sought to control history but had ultimately been consumed by it. The streets were packed with thousands of spectators, their faces cold and eager. The crowd that had once supported him, that had cheered for his transformation into citizen égalité, now jeered and shouted curses at him. The revolution had turned them into bloodthirsty witnesses. They did not care about the man who had once been a prince. They only cared for the spectacle. The revolution, in its most savage form, had become entertainment, an event to satisfy the bloodlust of a starving, vengeful populace. Philippe's cart rolled slowly through the streets, every bump a jolt of pain as he sat bound in his seat. The jeers grew louder as they neared the Place de la Révolution, the square where so many others had met their end. The scaffold stood tall, an executioner's stage bathed in a cold, cruel light. The guillotine was already set, its gleaming blade waiting, as silent as death itself. Philippe could see the crowd, their faces twisted in anticipation. The time had come. As he climbed the 13 steps to the scaffold, he was struck by the finality of it all. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of French society was now at the mercy of those he had once helped empower. The crowds continued their mocking cheers as he reached the top, his head exposed to the chilling air. Philippe's hands were trembling, but his eyes were clear. He had no last words, no speeches about liberty or the future of France. The Abbé de Fermont, the same priest who had attended King Louis XVI, offered him the last rites. Philippe refused. He had already embraced the revolution, and now, he would die as a citizen of the Republic, not as a royal. There would be no grand gestures, no final words of defiance or regret. The blade would speak for him. At 11:41 a.m., the executioner's assistants seized him. They forced him onto the plank, securing his head in the lunette, the metal frame that would hold him in place. Philippe's final breath was drowned out by the deafening roar of the crowd, shouting for justice, shouting for blood. At 11:42 a.m., the blade fell. A clean, swift stroke, a mercy in the midst of chaos. Philippe's head dropped into the wicker basket, its weight heavy with the symbolism of the moment. The crowd surged forward, eager to claim their pieces of history. The frenzy that followed was madness. They tore at Philippe's clothing, soaked rags in his blood, and carried away bits of the scaffold as souvenirs. Philippe Égalité, the Duke of Orleans, was dead. But in death, he had become just another symbol of the revolution's insatiable appetite for blood. The official record of his death was simple: death by guillotine. But the truth was far darker. Philippe had been consumed by the revolution he had once embraced, his life and death a tragic testament to how quickly power and fortune can slip away. He had thought that by embracing the revolution, he could escape his past, secure his future, and reshape France. But in the end, it was the revolution that reshaped him, until there was nothing left but his blood spilled in the streets. You've witnessed Philippe's journey from royalty to the guillotine. His story is one of ambition, betrayal, and a revolution that devours its own. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale and never miss a moment of historical truth like this again. Not subscribed yet? Why let history pass you by? If you're still hesitating, share why in the comments below. You won't want to miss what comes next. Philippe Galatea's execution was not just the end of a man, it was the culmination of the revolution's insatiable hunger for justice, or rather, its distorted version of it. The revolution, which had promised equality and freedom for all, had instead turned into a consuming force, devouring the very people who had once believed in it the most. Philippe's death was a symbol of this tragic irony. The revolutionary ideals he had embraced had ultimately claimed him, leaving nothing but blood and ash in their wake. After his death, Philippe's family, the once proud Orleans dynasty, was reduced to a footnote in history. The vast fortune, the estates, the power. Everything he had worked for, everything he had tried to preserve through his alliance with the revolution, was now irrelevant. Philippe, who had sought to reshape France in his image, had become another casualty of the very forces he thought he could control. The legacy of the Orleans family was erased in the streets of Paris, where the crowd had torn his clothing and stained their hands with his blood. In the end, Philippe's name, once a symbol of royal power, was now a symbol of failure, of a revolution that consumed even its most ardent supporters. But Philippe's death was more than just personal, it was political. The revolution, which had once seemed so idealistic, had now turned into a brutal spectacle. The blood of one aristocrat could not quench its thirst, and so the revolution moved forward, indiscriminately tearing down everything in its path. Philippe's execution was not a singular event, it was a reminder that no one was safe from the revolution's wrath. In the quest for justice, the revolutionaries had become what they had once despised. The symbolism of Philippe's death was unmistakable. He had been a man who thought he could navigate the currents of power, a man who believed that he could use the revolution to secure his own survival. Instead, he had been consumed by it. His death served as a warning to all who believed they could control the tides of history. The revolution, once sparked by the cries for liberty and equality, had grown into a force that devoured anyone who dared to think they could wield it. While Philippe's death marked the end of his direct influence on France, the story of his family did not end with his execution. Philippe's son, Louis Philippe, was an entirely different figure, one who would rise from the ashes of the revolution to claim the throne of France. But the irony of Philippe Galatea's legacy would not be lost on history. His son, the same Louis Philippe who had once been exiled to Austria and had fought alongside foreign armies, would eventually return to France, not as a revolutionary, but as a monarch. Louis Philippe, who had spent years in exile, came back to France in 1830 during the July Revolution, which led to the fall of the Bourbon monarchy. With the support of the people, he ascended to the throne as King Louis Philippe I, the so-called citizen king. The irony was staggering. Philippe Galate, who had once believed that he could guide France into a republic, had given his life for the revolution, and yet his son would wear the crown. Louis Philippe's reign was marked by contradictions. As king, he portrayed himself as a ruler for the people, a monarch who would bring stability to France after the chaos of the revolution. But his rule was anything but stable. The tensions between the monarchy and the republic grew, and by 1848, Louis Philippe was forced into exile once again, marking the end of the July monarchy. His return to power as king was seen by many as the final mockery of Philippe Galatea's original ideals. Philippe had hoped that the revolution would reshape the world, that his actions would lead to a new era of equality and justice. But in the end, his son's ascension to the throne highlighted the futility of his sacrifices. The Orleans family, who had once been so intricately woven into the fabric of France's aristocracy, was now a symbol of the revolution's twisted legacy, a legacy that, instead of eliminating monarchy, had brought it back in an ironic twist of fate. Philippe's legacy is complex. He thought he could control the revolution, but it controlled him instead. His life and death serve as a reminder of the fragile nature of power and the cost of betrayal. Subscribe to Flashback Historian for more lessons from history, where the past is never just a story, but a warning. Still not subscribing? Come on, you know you want to learn more. History like this doesn't come around every day. Why not let us know in the comments why you're holding back from discovering more? Philippe Égalité, born Philippe of Orleans, started life as the embodiment of French aristocracy, wealth, power, privilege. He seemed untouchable, destined to control the fate of France. He was a man who believed that power could be manipulated, that wealth could buy influence, and that revolution was simply another tool to wield. His name, once synonymous with luxury and political influence, became a symbol of the ultimate tragedy, the betrayal of one's own bloodline, the self-destructive gamble of ambition gone awry. Philippe's transformation from nobleman to revolutionary was not just political, it was psychological, a desperate act of reinvention in a world that was no longer kind to the old ways. He cast off the trappings of his royal birth, aligning himself with the revolutionaries, believing that he could use the chaos of the revolution to his advantage. But what he failed to see was the very nature of revolution: it devours its own. The deeper Philippe tried to embed himself within the new order, the more he alienated the very people he had once called family, the very system that had once protected him. When Philippe cast his vote for King Louis XVI's execution, he thought he was securing his place in history, choosing the revolution over the monarchy. But that vote sealed his fate, drawing the noose tighter around his neck. His betrayal of his own cousin was not just political, it was personal. It was an act that tore him from the heart of the French aristocracy, but it also set the stage for his tragic downfall. The revolution did not reward men like Philippe. It consumed them. Philippe's eventual arrest and execution were the final chapters in a tragic saga of misplaced loyalty and ambition. His once grand title, his vast wealth, and his influence in French society meant nothing in the face of the revolution's brutal demands. The same revolution he had supported now turned on him, claiming him as yet another casualty of its insatiable hunger for justice. His death on the scaffold, at the hands of the very people he had sought to align himself with, was the ultimate irony. Philippe Égalité had thought he could outwit the revolution, but in the end, it was the revolution that outwitted him, dragging him into the same abyss he had once helped create. Philippe's execution was not just a death, it was a symbol of the revolution's unrelenting drive to tear down all who stood in its way. It was the brutal end of a man who thought he could control history, and a reminder that revolutions do not tolerate those who try to shape them for their own gain. Philippe's death was not just a punishment for his political actions, it was a warning, a chilling reminder that no one is safe when the forces of history begin to unravel. Philippe Égalité's story is one of tragic irony, and the moral implications are impossible to ignore. His life and death serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of power, ambition, and the willingness to betray one's own family for the sake of survival. Philippe believed that by embracing the revolution, he could navigate the shifting tides of power, that he could remake himself and the world around him. But the revolution, once unleashed, was a force beyond anyone's control. Philippe's fate was sealed not by his enemies, but by his own actions, the very actions that he thought would secure his place in history. In the broader historical context, Philippe's death is a powerful commentary on the nature of revolutions. They are often born out of noble ideals, freedom, equality, justice, but they quickly transform into something darker. Revolutions devour those who dare to wield power within them. The revolution Philippe had embraced, a movement that promised equality, was the same force that ultimately destroyed him. His death represents the dangers of becoming too entangled in political forces, of losing sight of one's own humanity in the pursuit of power. Philippe's execution was not just about one man, it was about the revolution's tragic inevitability. It was about the mob's desire for blood, the hunger for retribution that cannot be satisfied. And in Philippe's case, it was about the revolution consuming its own champions, those who thought they could control it, only to be consumed by it in the end. His story is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power, the dangers of ambition, and the ruthless nature of revolution. History can be as brutal as it is fascinating. If you want more hard-hitting historical content like this, where the past is brought to life in all its dark, complicated glory, make sure to hit subscribe. Don't let the revolution pass you by. If you're still not subscribed, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Tell us why you haven't subscribed yet in the comments. Don't miss out on more incredible, untold history.